Hello, welcome everyone. Good evening. Start of the weekend. My name is Selka Strawn, and I'm here to kind of do the pre-intro. So you'll have a couple of us before we get to this evening's speaker, but hopefully we'll kind of layer it in nicely. I serve as the Deputy Director for Public Practice, Curatorial, and Research at the Spencer Museum of Art, so the gallery is just above. Please come and explore the galleries tomorrow. I am so pleased that we can all be here, whether in person in the Maryland Stockstead Lecture Hall at the University of Kansas, or wherever in streaming land you may be. I'd like to dwell a little to think about land, in particular the land where the University of Kansas's Lawrence campus is situated. This evening's talk will delve deeper into ideas of landscape. For those of you familiar with the Spencer Museum of Art and its current installations, you have hopefully seen and even spent time with a series of 5 panels that form the Native Host series located along the front plaza of the museum facing Mississippi Street. The significant work of public art by internationally renowned artist Hawkeye IV. Edgar Heap of Birds acts as a land acknowledgement, naming the 5 native tribes who historically or currently inhabit the region that is now called Kansas. The place name Kansas is derived from that of the Kaw Nation, or Kanza or Kanza. On each panel, which is created to look like a road sign, the colonial name of a location is printed backwards, while the name of the land's original occupants is printed forwards with the preface, "Today your host is." As Heap of Birds explains, the Kaw selection represents a historic tribe and river from the Lawrence area. The tribe has since been forcibly removed to Oklahoma Indian Territory near Ponca City, Oklahoma. The other 4 nations listed are the only tribes that have reservation status and land holdings in Kansas. These other 4 include the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, and the Nemehahaki, the preferred name for the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. I share all this as an affirmation of indigenous sovereignty and in recognition and support of Native communities. I also share to open up reflection on ideas of land, histories of the land, and the histories the land holds, notions of territory and property, the relation of land to humans and more than humans, and the ways in which artists approach these and other questions, areas we might consider with this evening's presentation that will explore the 3 distances concept in Chinese landscape painting. I'm really looking forward to this evening's Franklin D. Murphy lecture by Professor Alfreda Murck. This is the first of 2 Murphy lectures by Professor Murck. She will deliver the second in April. We are delighted that Professor Murck is able to be here in person this evening and that she can also be streamed online. Professor Murck joins us both as the Franklin D. Murphy lecturer and the Franklin D. Murphy professor, so Franklin D. Murphy squared. During her residency, she is co-teaching in a seminar that Professor Amy McNair is leading for the whole semester entitled Song Era Painting, China and Beyond. Professor Murck's public lectures are the latest in the series established in 1979 through the Kansas University Endowment Association in honor of former Chancellor Dr. Franklin D. Murphy, who led KU from 1951 to 1960. Dr. Murphy, a medical doctor as well as a scholar of medicine, endowed this lectureship series connecting the practice of art history within the academic department and the art museum. The Murphy Lectureship in Art brings distinguished art historians, critics, and artists to the University of Kansas, where they participate in the teaching of a graduate seminar in the Crest Foundation Department of Art History and deliver 2 public lectures. Normally, as we are kind of this evening, these are delivered at the Spencer Museum of Art and at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Most of the lectures are subsequently developed into books published by the University of California Press in association with the Crest Foundation Department of Art History and the Spencer Museum of Art. We look forward to the publication of Professor Murck's book in the same distinguished series. So thank you for allowing me to share some of this background. I'm now happy to welcome my colleague, Dr. Amy McNair, to the platform to introduce Professor Murck.
Thank you, Selka, and thank you so much, all of you, for attending. I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Alfreda Murck, a specialist in the history of Chinese painting and poetry. For many years, Dr. Murck was a curator in the Department of Asian Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and living in China from 1997 to 2013, she worked at the Beijing Palace Museum. She has taught at Beijing University and the Central Academy of Fine Arts. Most recently, she taught classes in Asian art at Columbia. As an example of the synergy that characterizes her career as a scholar, when she was living in China, she frequented the flea markets of Beijing, and there she collected cast-off objects decorated with imagery related to the gift of Pakistani mangoes that Chairman Mao had re-gifted to some Chinese workers during the Cultural Revolution. Her intellectual curiosity spurred research into this phenomenon, which she published as Golden Mangoes, the Life Cycle of a Cultural Revolution Symbol. She also collaborated on an exhibition of these artifacts and co-authored the museum catalog for Mao's Golden Mangoes and the Cultural Revolution, an exhibition held at the Museum Rietberg and the China Institute in New York from 2013 to 2015. The Murphy seminar that she and I are teaching this semester is Song-Era Painting, China and Beyond, which allows our students to tap Dr. Murck's expertise in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean painting. The students and I have enjoyed an intense week of learning from her, and now it is your turn. Please join me in welcoming the 36th Franklin D. Murphy Lecturer, Dr. Alfreda Murck.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. First, let me thank Professor McNair and David Catafors for the invitation to serve as the Franklin Murphy Lecturer. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a great honor. The hospitality has been fabulous, and the conversations with faculty and students, graduate students, has been really stimulating. So thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you for those who are tuning in virtually. I look forward to your comments and questions and corrections. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on the three distance compositions and on art and politics in the Northern Song. From the founding of the Northern Song in 960, art was a vital part of political culture. It was an important tool for the court to assert political legitimacy in display of paraphernalia, in art collections, and in newly made images. A Chinese painting colleague recently observed that in the 11th century, Song dynasty scholar painting was born out of fiercely passionate, socially divisive politics. And the text that we're looking at this evening was conceived amid the same contentious struggles. So Lofty Message of Forest and Streams is the first text to mention that mountains have three distances. Guo Si explains in the preface that as a boy he accompanied his father, the great painter Guo Xi, and jotted down his comments on painting. From those notes, Guo Si compiled Lofty Messages of Forest and Streams, which is full of the wisdom of an accomplished painter with practical details on brushes and inks and how to achieve a successful landscape. Lofty Message of Forest and Streams has been influential as a painting manual, and here you see a later interpretation of the three distances in the 17th century painting manual, Mustard Seed Garden. I would like to argue that in addition to its function as a painting manual, it was first of all Guo Si's effort to curry favor with Emperor Huizong in order to preserve his father's legacy and to improve his own position. This required careful editing of aspects of his father's artistic practice. In 1117, Guo Si submitted the completed text to Emperor Huizong. That was some 30 years after his father left imperial service. So let's start with a review of Guo Xi's illustrious career. The Guo family was from Wenxian, Heyang, that is in contemporary Henan province, just north of the Yellow River. Guo Xi traveled in the region where he saw spectacular mountains, perhaps something like this view of the Taihang mountain range. He was a well-established painter before a senior official brought him to the capital in 1068. Guo Xi quickly became the favorite painter of Emperor Shenzong. For 17 years, Guo Xi worked in Kaifeng, the capital, decorating multiple buildings, a Taoist temple, semi-public government halls, and palace interiors. His most celebrated mural was a snow scene painted for the Jade Hall of the Hanlin Academy. According to his son, however, Guo Xi himself considered 4 landscapes with weathered rocks to be his best. He presented those paintings to the Confucian temple in their hometown Wenxian upon his son passing the prefectural examination. Guo Si, the son, eventually earned the highest degree, which gave him a role in the imperial bureaucracy. Guo Xi's enthusiastic imperial patron, Emperor Shenzong, died in 1085. Guo Xi stayed in the capital for a time, but we don't know when he left or when he died. From his long career, only 2 paintings are widely regarded as original to his hand. His most renowned surviving masterpiece is this hanging scroll in the National Palace Museum, Taipei. It is something of a miracle that it survived all this time. Hand scrolls are easier to roll up and protect and preserve. This is a large hanging scroll. On the left-hand border of the painting, Guo wrote the title, Early Spring, the date equivalent to 1072, and signed his name. The painting presents a monumental peak flanked by deep valleys and populated by 13 figures. In this dynamic landscape, the figures communicate a harmonious society. At left are women returning from shopping. They're carrying children and parcels. Respecting the social hierarchy, Guo Xi painted the men, seen on the right, in a slightly higher plane. They are hauling in fishing nets, and one looks up at a central mountain. At the left edge of the painting, 2 Buddhist monks ascend a path. In the center, behind a huge boulder, a man is traveling on horseback, accompanied by young servants. Above him, 2 figures are painted in such dilute ink as to be almost invisible. In the mountain valley at the right, Guo Xi depicted a pavilion and a villa, and on the topmost peak, a temple compound. Although the silk has darkened, the liveliness of the brushwork still conveys the virtuosity of the artist and justifies its towering influence on later artists and art historians. One can see why Emperor Shenzong liked Guo Xi's work. According to Guo Si, his father painted small scenes for friends early in his life, and in Kaifeng, he continued that practice. The Metropolitan Museum is fortunate to have this small hand scroll, the second painting that is widely accepted as Guo Xi's. Unlike Early Spring, the hand scroll is only 35 centimeters in height, about 13 inches. And unlike Early Spring, it has no signature, no title, or date. It was likely painted in the 1080s at a gathering to send off someone departing from the capital, to return home, to go to a posting, or perhaps into exile. Indeed, Guo Xi arrived at the capital as Emperor Shenzong began his reign. The atmosphere at the court of Shenzong was marked by bitter disagreements over policies that soon became critiques of moral character, as well as debates on policy matters. Factional conflicts turned personal. Officials discovered that criticizing policies put them at risk of demotion or exile. Demotion might be to an insignificant post far from the capital. Exile was typically to malarial regions in the south of China, often a terminal experience. Others chose to resign to avoid the struggle. All of these departures would have occasioned farewell parties, with attendees creating paintings and poems, and Guo Xi very likely contributed paintings at those parties. Remember that a hand scroll was experienced as you unrolled it on a table in front of you, revealing the painting from right to left. So as you opened the painting, you would first see the low-lying hills, the figures in two boats, the leafless trees, the figures walking into the misty distance, and then you would see people preparing a picnic and a pavilion, and finally, elders with helpers walking toward the pavilion. We don't know who chose the title that is written on the outside of the scroll. Shu Se Pingyuan, Autumn Trees, Level Distance, goes back at least to a 14th century colophon that mentions this title. The Metropolitan Museum now uses the title Old Trees, Level Distance. The trees are old and mostly leafless, but the current title leaves out the implication in the Chinese title of autumn color on those last leaves. No identical title appears in the Shrinhe catalog of paintings completed in 1120, but early 12th century an early 12th century imperial seal confirms that the painting dates to the Northern Song. The attribution to Guo Xi is mentioned in the 14th century colophons, but on style alone, scholars have made a good case for early spring and the small hand scroll being by the same hand, albeit separated by a decade and created for very different audiences. Early spring was painted for someone at court, possibly the emperor himself, and intended for display in a large hall. The hand scroll was a less formal, occasional painting, probably for a farewell party, that would have been rolled up except when taken out to be appreciated by one or two people. One of the most charismatic personalities of this era was the brilliant, outspoken official Su Shi. Raised in a lively intellectual family in Sichuan, far from the hierarchy and protocol of the capital, Su Shi had a very independent mind. He was a great writer in prose and poetry, a fine calligrapher. He was an affable person who enjoyed people from all walks of life and who had an irrepressible sense of humor. Speaking truth to power repeatedly got him into trouble, but he also enjoyed dabbling in painting and often wrote about the interchangeability of painting and poetry. If you knew poetic language and something was paintable, you could put that in your painting. Early in Shenzong's reign, Su Shi requested a post out of the capital because of the increasing vicious policy debates. He was posted to Hangzhou, where he discovered the consequences of the new government salt monopoly. Because private production of salt was now a crime, thousands of farmers were imprisoned for making salt. He wrote satirical poems about the harm of the government policies, catchy poems that were recited and chanted in the streets. Several years later, Su Shi was arrested for those poems and convicted of great irreverence to the emperor. Disrespecting the emperor was a capital offense. Fortunate for Chinese culture, an empress dowager intervened, reminding Shenzong that Su Shi's examination papers had prompted her husband, Emperor Renzong, to boast that he had found a future prime minister. This appeal to respect Shenzong's father saved Su Shi's life. In 1080, he was banished with his family to a small hamlet on the Yangtze River. In light of these dangerous times, let us consider the descriptions of the three distances and some painted examples. Lofty Message of Forest and Streams describes high distance as follows. Looking up to the mountain's peak from its foot is called high distance. High distance appears clear and bright. The appearance of high distance is of lofty grandness. In this detail of a mural painted inside Li Daojian's 8th century tomb, the central panel most clearly shows what Guo Si called high distance. and the small hanging scroll at the right, found in a tomb at Yemaotai, probably represents a Taoist paradise and is composed around a dramatic high peak. Again, Gaoyuan, high distance. Most famous of the northern Song monumental landscapes is this painting by Fan Quan, about 1000 AD. It is a theme of the majesty of the mountain, and you can see the drama of the mountain and the scale from the little figures in the foreground with the donkeys moving through the landscape. The theme of the majesty of the dominant mountain is repeated several times in Lofty Message of Forest and Streams. As you look at a detail of this long hand scroll in the Beijing Palace Museum by Wang Ximeng, see what you think of this anthropomorphic description. A great imposing mountain is the host for surrounding mountains. In this way, the layout of surrounding hills, woods, and chasms is ordered, providing the principle for distant and near, large and small. Its appearance is like that of a sovereign, brilliant and awesome, with 100 servitors hastening to pay obeisance, and yet without any feeling of compulsion. Casting the main mountain as a benevolent sovereign would, of course, have pleased any emperor. Because this section of Lofty Message of Forest and Streams was circulating as early as 1110, it may have in part inspired Wang Ximeng's spectacular blue-green hand scroll. Huizong had discovered Wang Ximeng and personally oversaw the training of the teenager. At age 18, he spent 6 months painting this long hand scroll. This is just a tiny detail. In contrast to Guo Xi's monochromatic landscapes, this colorful landscape with mineral pigments evoking a Taoist paradise is the kind of painting that Huizong would have loved. In contrast to high distance, deep distance is a composition in which one looks from the front of the mountain, around the mountain, to its back. In deep distance, the forms become steadily more obscure. The idea of deep distance, the author says, is of repeated layering. An 8th century example is the simulated screen painted in the tomb of Han Xiu and Madame Liu near Xi'an. Several scholars have equated the observation that forms become more obscure as they recede with the Western idea of atmospheric perspective. After this description, however, deep distance gets almost no further discussion. Why do you suppose that is? Why not discuss deep distance? I think it's because deep distance has no literary tradition that lent it particular meaning. This landscape in Dunhuang Cave 172 is dated to the second half of the 8th century. It could fall into the category of deep distance, we're kind of looking around a mountain, or it could fall into the third category, which is level distance. Now, granted, Guo Si chose to concentrate on mountains for which his father was famous, but still, we might expect the third distance to at least mention water, which is one of the essential elements in every shanshui, every mountain and water painting. But water is present only as mist. The text, the level distance description is, looking from a nearby mountain at more distant mountains is called level distance. The idea of level distance is a repeated spreading forth to merge into mistiness and indistinctness. Now, level distance paintings had been around for centuries, as long as vistas over water had been painted. A rare watery landscape painted on hemp is thought to date from the late 8th century. Japanese scholars generally agree that it was painted in Japan after a Chinese model. This fragment in the Kyushu National Museum shows a watery world in which a stream tumbles at the left, a small figure rides a water buffalo, kind of in the middle, pairs of birds flit about, and two boats are moored at the upper right. This fragment was apparently cut from a larger textile that is in the Shoso in Treasury, Nara, Japan, but is not in the original inventory. The larger painting measures just under 2 feet high, almost 6 feet wide, suggesting that together with the other pieces, and there's another fragment in the Goto Museum, it might have been an unmounted horizontal banner, or huajiang, literally a painted fabric shield of the sort that picnickers might have hung at an outdoor party. My point is simply, these landscape modes, high, deep, and level, existed prior to the Song dynasty, but no one wrote about them in those terms. Some northern Song landscapes combine all three, as in the hand scroll, the magnificent hand scroll, attributed to Xu Daoning. The Nelson Atkins Museum dates the scroll to the mid-11th century. With transparent washes and flashing brush strokes, the painter created a high dominant mountain, deep valleys wrapping around mountains, and level recessions. Scholars have pointed out that Guo Xi's early spring also includes all three distances. The descriptions of the three distances indeed are general enough to embrace a wide variety of compositions, while sidestepping the metaphorical relationship of the level distance that was closely associated with reclusion and exile. In the late 11th century, there was an explosion of river and lake scenes. Officials who left the capital in disgrace were inspired to read the poetry of famous exiles and refugees of the past. One of those was Song Di, who drew on exile literature to create the 8 Views of Shaoxiang in the 1070s. About a decade later, Shen Kuo wrote, Assistant Secretary Song Di was a competent painter. He was especially good at level distance landscapes. Of those that are masterful, there are geese descending to level sand. Shen names all 8 titles and continues, they are called the 8 Views. Connoisseurs are talking about them. Geese descending to level sand suggests their southern terminus in Hunan, and you could not get a flatter painting than this 12th century painting now in Princeton. The court often sent troublesome officials to this region of China, the Shaoxiang region in modern, what is now Hunan province. As painters created level distance landscapes, poets stepped up to provide melancholy poems for those paintings. 7 prominent Song dynasty scholars, northern Song scholars, wrote poems for Guo Xi's level distance paintings. The following 2 couplets give the flavor and a key metaphor. Su Shi wrote, when tree leaves fall, the poet already resents the autumn and cannot stand level distance provoking poetic sorrow. And Chao Buzhi wrote, Dongting leaves fall, myriad autumn waves. Speaking of the man of the south, that would be Chu Yuan. I also feel sorrow. Now, why do poets in exile or poets writing in sympathy with scholars in distress mention leaves falling, often falling into waves or falling at Dongting? We can find the source for the image in commentaries to the poem Ladies of the Xiang. It is one of the 9 songs. Here are the 2 ladies of the Xiang. This in Boston, yes. Ladies of the Xiang is one of the 9 songs of about the 2nd century BCE. They are attributed to Chu Yuan, the archetype of all maligned loyal officials. Interpretations of the 9 songs were shaped by 4 commentaries. The earliest was the Han Dynasty scholar Wang Yi, who was aware of Chu Yuan's unjust exile and therefore wrote politically charged annotations. Imbuing the poems with a sense of aggrievement, he wrote, "It says that because the autumn winds are strong, the grasses and trees are shaking, the Xiang River has waves, the tree leaves are falling. This is to say, great men govern anxiously, and the people worry. What is more, worthy men have been injured. Others say that it means Chu Yuan saw the autumn winds rising and tree leaves falling and grieved that the year was advancing to its end and that he was getting old." Crown Prince Zhaoming of the Liang selected 6 of the songs for inclusion in the influential anthology Wenxuan. When the 7th century scholar Li Shan annotated the anthology, he copied in Wang Yi's commentaries. So when you consult the Wenxuan, you'll be looking at Wang Yi's commentaries. But that didn't end it. Early in the 8th century, Emperor Xuanzong asked for a new set of annotations. All the meanings had in fact been amplified and evolved. The group, called the 5 Ministers, gave a pithy summary of how the image had evolved. They wrote, "A metaphor for petty men taking authority, and therefore great men being cast aside." Isn't that exactly what a wronged official would like to shout from the rooftops? But that would be indiscreet. They couldn't do that. In this detail of Ladies of the Xiang, we see that the leaves on the deciduous tree have fallen into the waves below, and the branches are completely bare. By contrast, in this little detail of an illustration of Ladies of the Xiang, leaves are tumbling down. This is actually, it does happen later painting, but it's quite rare. This is a painting formerly in the Fujida collection. Painter unknown, but it's a wonderful painting and very literal in all its details. So the relevant meaning for officials in trouble was not in the poetic description of autumn, but was concealed in the commentaries to that line. The phrase on tree leaves falling contained metaphors for careers damaged and lives lost, images that were at odds with the court's vision of loyal courtiers honored to serve in the ordered hierarchical society depicted in Guo Xi's Early Spring. The most audacious level distance landscape is the one attributed to Wang Shen, a dashing military man who married into the imperial family. Misty River Layered Peaks is a hand scroll in ink and color on silk in the Shanghai Museum. Sorry, not there yet. There we are. So you'll see that the first, more than the first, we were talking about, in class, about the green cloud. Is it a cloud or is it a mountain? There it is. So the first 2/3 is just a river with 2 almost invisible boats. So it must have felt like a practical joke as you opened this scroll and you're just, okay, you can see there's an edge, a little river shore, but then you move along and only when you come to the boats floating in the middle, hard to see there, you realize that, well, maybe there is something here. So you keep rolling and find that there are beautiful mountains at the end. So Su Shi wrote poems that concealed meanings even more than just reference to annotations. Su Shi and Wang Shen followed the practice of rhyming a poem, but that they both recognized, but they did not name the poem. In the case of Misty River Layered Peaks, Su lifted rhyme words from a long poem by the 8th century poet Du Fu. Su Shi included lots of clues to ensure that Wang Shen would see his source. Du Fu was writing in sympathy with two friends who were out of office and was downplaying the prestige of serving at court. He reminded them of the inconvenience of morning audience, at which the emperor ascended the throne at the moment of sunrise. This meant that officials had to rise in darkness, put on their formal robes, and be at the throne hall before the first rays of dawn. In the long poem, Autumn Day in Queifu Prefecture, Du Fu wrote, "Would you please explain incessantly attending morning audience? How can that compare to the security of drunken sleep?" To sleep in warm. Matching Du Fu's rhyme, in his poem to Wang Ximeng, Su Shi wrote, "From tall pines snow fell, startling my drunken sleep." We can be certain that Su Shi chose this phrase to rhyme because he enjoyed and appreciated Du Fu's couplet, and because he knew Wang Ximeng was familiar with Du Fu's poem and would understand the reference. From the point of view of the court, however, the sentiment would have been subversive, even if not obvious from Su Shi's surface meaning. On the question of service at court, lofty message of forest and streams leaves no room for men indulging in sleeping in, drunk. No reclusion. So we'll look again at Wang Ximeng's beautiful hand scroll as I read to you what it has, lofty message has to say about court service. All men love the beauty of mountains and rivers, and all would like to be hermits rambling in forests and mists. This, however, is an age when men are eager to offer themselves for service. Now is a time of great peace and prosperity. Both sovereign and parents are concerned for everyone. If one is born in such a pure time when men take office and women are chaste and pure, how could a benevolent man possibly wish to retreat from worldly affairs and custom? So Guo Si is making clear that wise and compassionate sovereigns such as Shenzong and his son Huizong, Emperor Huizong, attract men to service at court. Finally, we come to Shenzong's reign. In 1100, Shenzong's 11th son, then just aged 18, was put on the throne as Emperor Huizong. At the beginning of his reign, a general amnesty was declared, which allowed all political exiles like Su Shi and Huang Tizhen to return home. This was part of an effort to reconcile the warring political factions. After less than a year, the effort at reconciliation collapsed. All officials who had opposed Emperor Shenzong's policies were declared guilty of sedition, and most were exiled to distant southern villages. The list of names was engraved in stone in Huizong's distinctive slender gold calligraphy. For several years, the names of people connected to those criminals were added to the list until in 1106, a comet, a sign from heaven, prompted Huizong to forbid further additions. He ordered the stele destroyed and the woodblock prints of the list destroyed as well. So in conclusion, let me tell you what happened in 1117. In 1117, Guo Si was serving in a post in what is now Sichuan province. He befriended the prefect Xu Guangning, whose father had known and admired Guo Xi. Prefect Xu was likely instrumental in helping Guo Si get an introduction to Emperor Huizong. By then, Guo Xi's fame had sadly diminished. Emperor Huizong had replaced Guo Xi's landscapes with more ancient paintings and with more recent auspicious bird and flower paintings. Maybe Guo Si didn't know, but a scholar later in the 12th century reports that some of Guo Xi's discarded paintings were being repurposed as cleaning rags. Because he was submitting the text to an emperor who had low regard for Guo Xi's art and who had persecuted many of Guo Xi's admirers and who were well aware and and he, the emperor, who was well aware of the association between exile and level distance landscapes. We may be sure that Guo Si chose his words carefully. Lofty message of forest and streams was specific to Guo Si's time and agenda. He reflected Huizong's values promoted at the court when he wrote that his reasons for compiling lofty message of forest and springs were filial, that is, honoring his parents and all elders, wanting to preserve the techniques and insights of his father for fellow connoisseurs, and to record for descendants the profundity of Guo Xi's virtue, his fine character, filiality, and benevolence. Now I think we can understand why Guo Si wrote a description of level distance landscapes so very different from the watery landscapes that were being titled level distance. From the circumstances outlined and the timing of Guo Si's presentation to the emperor, I offer 4 thoughts. First of all, Guo Si wanted to distance his father from the association of level distance landscapes with literary tropes that referred to living on rivers and lakes as an exiled official or recluse. Secondly, he wanted to distance his father from the officials such as Su Shi, who had written those melancholy poems for his father's paintings. Mere association with their names may have been enough to bring a charge of factionalism. Guo Si's preface, third, describes Guo Xi, his father, as thoughtful, insightful, and familiar with poetry. In the status-conscious world of capital society, Guo Si seems to have been elevating his father to a status closer to a scholar-painter than a craftsman. He thereby linked his father to the broader literary culture, even while obscuring his ties to the critics of the court. And fourth, an important criterion for holding office was demonstrating filial piety, as I mentioned, respecting your parents and by extension all elders and honoring your ruler. Honoring his father's legacy was a principle behind many of Emperor Huizong's policies. Guo Si reminded Emperor Huizong of the respect in which his father, Emperor Shenzong, had held Guo Xi. In submitting lofty message to Huizong, Guo Si was demonstrating his filial piety. Huizong demonstrated his own filiality by accepting the treatise, granting Guo Si a second audience, and appointing him to the imperial archives. So it's a great success for Guo Si. The 3 distance formulation explains little about Chinese painting and leaves out important aspects of Guo Xi's practice. But when understood as a rhetorical strategy, it is valuable in alerting us to the sensitivity of the newly popular composition in the 11th century. In the charged factional atmosphere of the late Northern Song, the level distance landscape composition became a mode of political expression by appropriating the literary associations of living as an exile on rivers and lakes. Writing long after his father's career had ended, Guo Si explained away level distance and exaggerated the majesty of the mountain. Now, John Ferguson indexed the painting titles listed in 108 books. This is in the 1930s, mostly catalogs. High distance does not appear at all in the titles. Deep distance occurred in only 7 if you count 2 duplicates. But level distance occurred in 117 titles, reflecting the long enthusiasm for the theme that began in the 11th century. Level distance paintings were not just compositional modes, nor were the 3 distances a system primarily concerned with the problem of perspective. Level distance landscapes relate to the dislocation of men no longer players in government and of those who fell out of favor with the emperor. Without understanding the intense factional politics of the late 11th century and the artistic culture it generated, we can't grasp the dilemma that Guo Si faced when he wrote the passages asserting that mountains have 3 distances. For his part, Emperor Huizong seized the chance to play one of his favorite roles, cultural arbiter, to make a gesture of reconciliation towards the dissidents of his father's reign and to demonstrate his own filiality. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Wei Tian, up here.
Thank you for the lecture. I have two questions. First one is when you say the three-level distance does not capture all the Guo Xi's painting techniques. I wonder, because ever once after I start to use the three distance to look at painting, I cannot escape the three way of looking across, looking up. I wonder what are the other compositional elements that are not captured in the three distance.
I think there must be about a dozen different ways that painters configured mountains. So, there can be chasms, there can be a huge variety of ways of configuring a mountain. So these are just big catch-alls. I mean, Guo Si had a problem to solve. His father had painted for men who became criminals and who wrote poems for his paintings. So he had to find a way to just, and it's not that the emperor didn't see what he was doing. He overlooked it. He accepted that. So I think, of course, I mean, as I was trying to show with the Tang Dynasty examples and the early Northern Song examples, all of those compositions are there in great variety, but there's still more. There isn't any, I think it's just a little, it's just a simple way of encapsulating these three and providing two other to pair with the level distance. Yes, second question.
If I may, if you are meeting Wang Ximeng in the 18-year-old Wang Ximeng, and who was eager to offer his service to a government that so many people were so disappointed about, what kind of advice would you tell him? Or if you
I'm not understanding you.
If you are meeting Wang Ximeng,
if I was to meet Wang Ximeng, yes.
And then recognizing that he was eager to offer the service to a system that so many people were disappointed about, would you give him any advice? You don't have to answer.
I want to hear your response to your own question. I don't know what I would say. Watch out. Be careful. He died very young, and it's said, or it's speculated. We don't know how he died at 20. What was it? 24. Anyway, there's speculation that there was jealousy because he was so much in favor with Emperor Huizong. I don't know. But so anyway, I'd say be careful. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Murck, for the great lecture. Your talk really gave me an opportunity to rethink about those three perspectives, the high distance or deep distance and level distance. I used to just consider them as like foreground, middle ground, background. My idea was really refreshed. But I'm interested in learning about how you think about, are these three distance, are three types of angle or perspective of observation, or are they three types of scenery to be depicted, or are they like three stereotypical device to construct a certain mental image for the painter? Because after hearing about your lecture, I felt there are more things related to those terminologies rather than just angle or perspective. And also I have another piece of curiosity, because you convincingly argued that the level distance was more or less associated with the exile culture, and also those deported officials like unsatisfaction with the court or Emperor Huizong. So I'm interested in learning a little bit more about how did Guo Si managed to, alienate himself and his father from that. More specifically, how did he manage to do so to win the favor of the emperor again? Thank you.
So on the three distances, it invites you to think about perspective because he does say from the foot of the mountain. So it's like you're standing at the foot and you're looking up to the top. So there is that sense that there is a perspective. And you're looking, I still don't know what he means about Hui Kan. You're peeking around the mountain, whatever that means. It may have some wordplay. So, but I can assure you that throughout this text, there are funny things going on that the emperor would have noticed and probably chuckled at, because he picks up some terms that are used in the Tang Dynasty, in Dufu's poems and other poems, that mean sobbing, but also mean water running over rocks. And he says, water that is still is, so if water isn't Chanyuan, if water isn't flowing over rocks, if water isn't moving, it's dead water. It's just I don't know. Chanyuan is a term that doesn't appear in the classics, any of the classics. It only appears in early literature, in the songs of the South, the Chuzi, and so it's picked up by people who are writing about Chuyuan and writing about sadness. And Wang Ximeng evokes it after Su Shi dies, writing about the spring again, Chanyuan is again flowing. He's writing to another of Su Shi's followers. So there are things in Lin Chuan Gaozhi, in the Law of Demon, that suggests that Guo Si was working to keep that separate, to develop that separation. And then he has this sponsorship of Xu Guangning, who is a very high official, actually. He had roles in the government that was higher than a prefect. And he had been awarded by the court a couple times. So I think that also helped with the imperial reception of the text. Any other questions?
Hello. Thank you very much for your lecture. That was really wonderful. I'm an architecture major, so this is a little bit like outside of my league, but I was curious if the use of color has any meaning in the paintings that we looked at.
Sure. Yeah, it does. So this blue-green is very much associated with Taoist paradise. And then if something is too black, is too inky, like night rain, how do you paint rain at night? So that is a very sort of negative down formulation. And then, yeah, definitely. And then, of course, red and gold are the colors of the imperial household. So, yeah, there's lots of color symbolism in China. And 5 colors are paired with the 5-phase theory. So it goes on and on. Some are auspicious, some are not so auspicious.
Thank you, Professor Murck. I have a question because you argue that the level distance really have a strong political relation with the exile, and the title of level distance was like vastly circulated in the literati circle, and I wonder what does the later literati did the later literati realize this strong political association with the level distance? If they did, or did this like idea was whitewashed by Guo Si, or if the later literati also realized strong political idea in this level distance, how did they avoid to get trouble when they doing paintings?
Yeah, they definitely recognize Guo Si did not succeed in deceiving all of the literati of China. The Tang poetry is there, the 8 views of Xiao and Xiang are there, and there is a quantity of level distance painting. I mean, think of at the Metropolitan Museum, there's a Zhao Mengfu painting of 2 pines and level distance. There are lots of paintings that Zhao Mengfu did another painting where geese are descending in a level distance scene. He doesn't. It's just called Shuicun, the water village, but it's definitely a level distance painting for an official who was out of office. I think in that case just retired, not actually banished. But no, it's there. People know it, but it's not. It's not an issue in later, as far as I know, in later painting. But it's usually in a hand scroll, right? And then the hand scroll is put away.
Hi, Dr. Murck.
Okay.
My question is, I think I just wanted a little bit more clarification. So when Guo Si was writing about the 3 distances, in his kind of argument or understanding of them, is he trying to say that Guo Xi was using all 3 of them at the same time, like how we kind of interpret early spring, or was that not really part of the argument or part of his interpretation, as we kind of get this level distance in the hand scroll that we attribute to Guo Xi, which is the point of the hand scroll is it's level distance. There's no other really distances that are too important to it. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of wanted to clarify, what was Guo Si's take on the relationship between the 3?
So I think he didn't intend for them all to be in one composition, because he goes on to say the figures should be in a high distance, they should be bright they're different atmospheres and different specifications for figures in the 3 distances. So that assumes that they have a slightly different life. Although I think some of the analyses of the early spring scroll are actually kind of interesting. Although beyond the central peak being Gaoyuan, being the high distance, there's lots of disagreement about which is deep, which is ping, which, So, I don't know. At any rate, I think he probably was thinking of different compositions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your lecture. And you mentioned that the rebel distance landscape were not welcomed by court. But how they gave title as rebel distance? Like it's too obvious. Like the disagree with court.
Amy, did you understand the question?
Do you mean that, did the court
Yeah, the
give a
rebel
different
distance.
title to a level
They
distance painting?
just gave a lot of title as rebel distance. Like you showed that.
Was level distance used at the court?
Yeah, not the court, but how can I say that? Like one second, I just some of them.
Who was giving the title level
Right.
distance? Was it the court?
Court or like the
Or-
painter?
Yes.
At the time, it was, well, first of all, the poets who write poems and say, I'm writing for Guo Xi's level distance painting. And then the catalogers yeah. So catalogers often assign titles. And it's actually quite rare when a painter assigns a title.
But did the catalog from the same, like dynasty or later? Later generation or the contemporary?
Was it during the Song, or was that done later?
Oh, the assigning of titles?
Yes.
Well, some are immediately in the Northern Song with the Xuanhe catalog of paintings. And some are done by other catalogers or other collectors. And then a lot are assigned in the 18th century when when Qianlong's catalog is assembled. Wait, no. No, I'm pointing to you, Wei Tian.
Okay. We will have one question from online by Professor Rosmi Hammers. She says, "Thank you, Freda. Very interesting lecture. I think extremely useful interpretation to help us understand the text. I think at the beginning, why does the Junzi take delight in painting is a great advertisement hook. Any thoughts about connections between Zongbing's descriptions of land and space?"
So why does the Junzi take pleasure in the...
She thinks that Junzi takes delight in painting is a great advertisement hook. And she wonders, do you have any thoughts about the connection between Zongbing's description of land and space?
There are some similarities, and I'm going to look into that further as I work on a book text.
I think we should thank our guest one more time. Thank you.